right now, or climate change, which is one of the biggest issues of our lifetime. So we can think about all these things as globalization. So now I'm going to talk about trade, and I guess that's where I'll end. Even though I have slides on migration and capital mobility, but probably I won't have time to go through all these. So let's talk about international trade in goods and services. The first question to ask when we talk about trade is why do countries trade? Why do countries engage in trade? And international trade has been going on for thousands of years now. Okay, so why do countries engage in trade? And we have two classical trade models. These are models of trade based on comparative advantage. And the idea in these models is that it makes sense for countries to specialize in goods which they are relatively better at, that they are better at producing in relative terms, and then exchange in the international market, and that way they can get something cheaper from abroad than they could make it domestically. So that's where the gains from trade come from. And this is captured into workhorse models called the Ricardian model of trade and the Hexagon model of trade. And then you have a more recent model of trade based on increasing returns and love of variety, which is called the Krugman model. So on the next slide, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about these models. Oh, actually, no. So there's no detail. Okay. Let me tell you a little more. So in the Ricardian model, countries have different productivities or technologies, and that is what gives rise to comparative advantage. So the original Ricardian model was written more than 200 years ago. It appeared in a book by David Ricardo in 1817, and he was talking about two countries, England and Portugal, and goods like cloth and wine. And through a very simple numerical example, he showed that England is better at producing both cloth and wine, but still Portugal has a comparative advantage in wine, and England has a comparative advantage in cloth, because what matters for comparative advantage is the opportunity cost. So the opportunity cost of producing cloth is less in England, and the opportunity cost of producing wine is less in Portugal, and that's why even though Portugal has lower productivity in both, in relative terms, Portugal is better at making wine, and therefore both countries can gain from trade by exchanging wine for cloth. So England would export cloth, and Portugal would export wine, and both of them would be off. 100 years later, two Swedish economists, Heckscher and Orlin, they wrote down a model where trade was based on comparative advantage as well. But the source of comparative advantage here was endowment differences. So different countries have different endowments. So what he was thinking about was trade between, say, the US and Europe during the period 1870 to 1913. And at that time, Europe was exporting manufacturing to the US, say textiles and things, and was importing a lot of agricultural goods. So why did the US have a comparative advantage in agricultural goods and Europe a comparative advantage in manufacturing? And their theory was that it's because the US is abundant in land. US has a lot of land and very few people. As a result, land is cheap in the US, and since for agriculture you need land, that means agricultural goods are cheaper in the US, and that's why US has a comparative advantage. So the Hexagon model is based on the idea of different countries being differently endowed with resources, different resources, and as a result, if you are well endowed with some resource, you will have an advantage in making goods which depend on that resource. Okay, so climate could be a resource. Tropical countries have a climate suitable for producing mangoes, and that's why they produce a lot of mangoes and export a lot of mangoes. So So I get to eat mangoes in Southern California, even though the US does not produce any mangoes, because we can import it from Mexico and from Philippines and Peru and sometimes India as well. Okay, so that's the idea of Ricardian model. The newer model of trade based on increasing returns and love of variety. This is the Krugman model, for which Paul Krugman won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2008. And so in these kind of models, the idea is that a lot of production processes have economies of scale or increasing returns to scale. That is, if you produce good at a large scale, then your average cost of production is going to be less. So you can think of cars, for example. So if you just produce 1,000 cars a year in a factory, it's going to be very expensive because there's a huge amount of fixed cost in producing a car. You have to set up a big factory with an assembly line and so on, which is very costly. So for car production to be cost effective, you have to produce it at a minimum scale. So scale enters into the picture. And also there's this idea that consumers have a love of variety. That is, they want to choose from a variety of goods. So if your family has say 3 cars, it's unlikely that they will be the same model. Okay, unless you are forced to buy say just Ambassador or something, you want to have different models. So if you have 10 dresses, they are going to be 10. Which is called intra-industry trade. That is, countries could be exchanging goods within the same industrial classification. So the United States could be exporting cars to Europe, and Europe could be exporting cars to the US. So there's a two-way exchange of goods within the same industry. And in my undergraduate trade class, I give an extreme example of two-way trade. So the United States imports and exports golf clubs. So if you look at the US trade in golf clubs, so every year the US exports golf clubs worth $350 million and imports golf clubs worth $350 million. So there's kind of balanced trade in golf club, but the point is that there's two-way trade. So golf clubs come in different varieties, and consumers like variety. So someone wants a particular type of golf club, and other people like a different kind. And so it makes sense for countries to exchange these goods, which come in different varieties. Anyway, so these are kind of theoretical ideas about why countries trade, and also you can see how they can gain from trade. And on this slide, I have some numbers. So first, about the classical theories of trade, models of comparative advantage. So in these models, gains arise due to specialization. I've kind of already talked about it. So the question is, can we quantify these gains from trade? And there is a way to quantify the gains from trade. And I have some numbers back of the envelope calculation based on a formula by these two economists, Eaton and Porton. So if you look at trade numbers for India for 2018, import to GDP ratio for India was 23.5 in 2018, and export to GDP ratio was 19.74. And based on that, these two numbers, you can calculate if an Indian person spends 100 rupees on different goods and services, what part of that 100 rupees is on domestically produced goods and services, and what part is on imported goods and services. And it turns out with these numbers that 77 paisa will be on domestically produced goods and 23 paisa will be on imported goods. And if there's a trade elasticity of 4, so this elasticity is how does trade respond to trade costs, and people have come up with different numbers, but most of the numbers are around 4. So if you use this number of 4, then what it gives you is that the gains from trade for India is roughly 6.7% of GDP. So what it means is that if India were to close its economy to trade completely, roughly speaking, there would be a 7% loss in GDP. Okay, so if India were to go back into autarky, then it would lose about 7% of GDP. That's a rough idea about what our gains from trade are. So these are static gains. I'm going to talk about dynamic gains issues next time. So these are kind of one-time gains. So this is if you use the classical approach of comparative advantage. But now, if you take into account gains from trade due to access to a larger number of varieties and which are available at lower prices, which is the Krugman model, then you can come up with some numbers as well. So, to economists Broda and Weinstein, they had done some estimation for the US, and so they had found that the value to US consumers of expanded import varieties over this period, 1972 to 2001, was about 2.6% of GDP. So these are not very large numbers. These numbers tend to be so small when you look at the static gains from trade. And there's also a paper trying to estimate how India can gain from trade due to the availability of larger variety of inputs. So this is for firms. So firms also have access to a large number of inputs when a country opens up to trade, and that improves the productivity of firms. So just as consumers have love of variety, you can think of a love of variety in production functions as well. That is, productivity of a firm improves if they have access to a large variety of inputs, and they quantified these gains for India, and they found substantial gains from trade due to availability of large variety of inputs. Okay, now we come to the dynamic gains from trade. So this earlier we were talking about just one-time gain. It's like in trade terms, maybe your production possibility frontier shifts one time, but can trade help the growth process? Can it give a boost to growth? That is, can it raise the growth of a country from 3% to 4%? Now the evidence on that is less clear cut. Okay, so the evidence on static gains is more straightforward, but if you look at macro evidence, cross-country regressions on trade and growth relationship, the evidence is weak. So it's not really clear whether trade gives a boost to growth, whether you can have sustained growth because of trade. Even though there's anecdotal evidence, a lot of evidence from East Asian countries, they had tremendous growth over the last 40, 50 years, and all of them were involved in the global economy. They were exporting a lot. But establishing causality from trade to growth has been difficult. Okay, if you look at micro level evidence, is it the case that firms that are engaged in trade, whether they experience productivity growth? There is some evidence of that. So one influential paper there is using plant level Chilean data by Nina Pachnik, and she finds substantial increase in plant productivity upon trade liberalization. There are a couple of papers on India that I want to mention. So one is by Praveen Krishna and Vashish Mitra, and they find that in the post-reform period, the farm productivity increased significantly. So post-91 period, when India liberalized its trade, reduced its tariffs and so on, they find that farm productivity growth on average was 3 to 6% higher than in the pre-reform period. And there's another study by Petya Topalova, where she finds that for a 4-digit industry in India, a 10% point reduction in tariffs leads to a 0.5% increase in TFP. So TFP is total factor productivity, and this is a measure of productivity for a firm. So how productive a firm is, so you net out the contribution of various inputs, labor and capital, etc., from output, and whatever is left, that is kind of the technology component or productivity component. So if that component increases over time, that means the firm experiences productivity growth. And so Topalova finds that reduction in tariffs increases TFP growth, and this ties in with the paper that I was talking about earlier about India, this paper Khandelwal, Pavnik, and Topalova paper, where firms gain by having access to a larger number of varieties. So these two papers are kind of similar, that reduction in tariff allows firms to import more, and as a result, their productivity improves. Okay, there's a more recent study by Nick Bloom and his co-authors. They look at various European industries, and they look at the impact of trade with China. How does import competition from China affect these firms' productivity? And what they find is that import competition has made life harder for low-tech firms, and many firms were forced to exit. So many firms go out of business. But the firms that survive, they engage in more innovative activities. They become more innovative. They spend more on R&D, patent creation, and so on, and information technology, and that leads to an increase in productivity. So more competition with China is inducing these firms to become more innovative and thereby increase their productivity. Okay, so all these things that I've talked about, gains from trade and so on, they are from the economy as a whole point of view. So they are economy-wide gains from trade. However, we see a lot of backlash against globalization. So it's important to ask the question: does everyone gain from trade? And the answer clearly is no. And so we have this old theorem from 1941 by Wolfgang Stolper and the famous Paul Samuelson, and the theorem basically says that when a country opens up to trade, and if a country has many factors of production, trade is going to have a redistributive effect. So some factors of production are going to gain, and some factors of production are going to lose. So in general, abundant factors of production gain from trade, and scarce factors of production lose from trade. Now this clearly means that trade is producing winners and losers. Yeah? And if you think about the trade between developed and developing countries these days, it could potentially raise inequality in developed countries and lower it in developing countries. So the kind of trade that is going on between developed and developing countries these days is mostly a two-way exchange of manufactured goods. So China exports a whole lot of manufactured goods to the US and Europe, and China also imports a whole lot of manufactured goods from these countries, even though China also imports a lot of agricultural goods from the US and Europe, but most of it is still manufacturing. Now, we can understand this kind of trade using a Heckscher-Ohlin type model, where we can think of manufacturing as being of two types. One is high-tech manufacturing, which uses a lot of skilled labor, and one is low-tech manufacturing, which uses a lot of unskilled labor. And so rich countries have a comparative advantage in high-tech manufacturing, which uses a lot of skilled labor, and developing countries have a comparative advantage in low-tech manufacturing, which uses a lot of unskilled labor. And so what trade in this kind of setting will do, it will increase the reward of the abundant factor and lower the reward of the scarce factor. So that will be that can be translated as a increase in the reward of skilled labor in rich countries and decrease in the reward of unskilled labor. So that would increase inequality in rich countries, and the opposite would happen in developing countries. So inequality is predicted to go down in developing countries. And when you look at evidence, what you'll find is there's a lot of evidence of rising inequality in rich countries. So it is consistent with the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, and you would expect trade to lead to an increase in inequality, and there's some evidence of that. For India, there's this paper by Kumar and Mishra, and they find some evidence of reduction in wage inequality in India due to trade liberalization. However, it has been observed that inequality has been rising everywhere, so in rich and poor countries. So a lot of developing countries have also experienced a rise in inequality, and people think that it's mainly due to the kind of technological change that has been going on. So people have tested trade versus technology as potential explanations for the rising inequality, and most of the evidence is in support of what is called skill bias technological change. So the technological change that has been happening is biased towards skilled labor, and you can think of computerization, use of internet, and so on. That increases the productivity of skilled workers. As a result, inequality is rising. Skilled workers are experiencing faster increase in wages compared to unskilled workers, and so on. However, there's another kind of trade, which is trade in inputs, something that I haven't talked about yet, and that's also called offshoring. So what these firms are doing is they are fragmenting their production process, and they're undertaking some part of the production process in other countries, developing countries. So you can think of this trade as buying inputs from abroad as well. So this kind of trade is called offshoring. So for example, General Motors assembles say cars in Detroit, but it produces a lot of inputs for its cars in Mexico. So that would be an example of offshoring. So those inputs, say steering wheels or gearboxes, they're produced in a factory in Mexico, and then they are shipped back to Detroit, where they're put in General Motors cars. So that is an example of offshoring. And this kind of offshoring or rise in offshoring can explain increase in inequality in both developed and developing countries. So increased offshoring means General Motors is offshoring more and more of production process of cars, and what happens in these cases is that the parts of production which are offshored later tend to be more skill intensive than before, and so the jobs that are coming to Mexico, that tend to be more skill intensive than before, and that raises the demand for skilled labor in Mexico as well, and so that could explain the rise in inequality there as well. So this is shown empirically in a paper by Feenstra and Hansen, how increase in offshoring can increase inequality in both developing and developed countries. Okay, so that kind of inequality that I was talking about assumes that different factors of production, say skilled and unskilled labor, are affected differently in terms of how much wages they get. But traditionally, trade theory has assumed that all consumers have identical preferences. They consume all goods in same proportions, which is a simplifying assumption. It does not really hold in reality, but people thought that all the action in trade was on the supply side, in the sense that on the production side, opportunity cost and so on, and if wages are deferred, that there could be rise in inequality, but we didn't have to worry much about consumption patterns differing. So there's some recent work that people have different consumption patterns. As a result, trade could affect their consumption basket differently, and as a result, it could affect their utility or welfare differently. So there's a recent paper by Fazalbaum and Khandelwal, and there they find that trade has different impacts on the welfare of people at different percentiles of income distribution. So this is a 40-country study, and India is included in the study. So there are 27 European countries and 13 non-European countries, and they find that on average, high-income people would lose 28% of purchasing power if orders were closed to trade, but poorest 10% of consumers would lose 63% of purchasing power because they buy relatively more imported goods. So if you go to a supermarket in the US, you will see most of the goods are imported there, and consumers are low income consumers are likely to spend more on these goods. High income consumers tend to buy more services which happen to be non-traded goods, so they buy more vacations and go to massage parlors and so on, while low-income consumers tend to spend more of their income on actual goods rather than services, and most of them tend to be imported, and that's why they would lose more if if a country stopped importing these goods. So in the US case, it would be basically China. So if you stop importing goods from China, it's the lower income consumers who would be hurt more. That's kind of the idea. And for India, they found that gains are slightly different. So a consumer at 10th percentile gains 19%, while a consumer at 90th percentile gains 6%. So these gains are much smaller for India than the average they found for all these 40 countries. And they explain that gains for poor are less in India because Indian exports are intensive in goods consumed by the poor. And when you export these goods, their prices go up. So the reason why you export them is because the prices are higher in the world market. So exporting these goods raises their domestic price as well, because if someone can export it at a higher price in the world market, they are not going to sell it at a lower price in the domestic market. And so that is part of the reason why the gains are less for India. Anyway, so there is a redistributive effect of trade here through consumption patterns as well, and the bottom line is that different income groups gain different amounts from trade. Okay, so those were all kind of standard models, and now we are going to discuss some non-standard issues, things that have been researched in recent times. So earlier, it was widely believed that unemployment was a macroeconomic phenomenon, while trade simply affected the allocation of resources between different sectors of the economy. So the idea is that if you open up to trade, what will happen is that your export sector is going to expand, and your import competing sector is going to contract. As a result, resources, which means labor and capital, they are going to move from your import competing sector to the export sector. So that is what we mean by reallocation of resources. And the standard trade model assumed that this reallocation is a frictionless process. There's no cost for a worker from moving from a steel mill that has closed in Pittsburgh to say Boeing's factory in Seattle, because steel is an import competing sector in the US, and aircraft is an export sector. So that movement was assumed to be seamless, but that is not true in reality. And in reality, you have unemployment in the economy, and these workers could be unemployed in the interim, or it could be very costly for them to move from Pittsburgh to Seattle, and so on. So newer models of trade incorporate these issues. That is, the movement of labor is from one sector to another is costly, and labor can be unemployed. And I have contributed a lot to this literature. So whenever you see a Ranjan there, it's kind of I'm author or co-author on this paper. So I changed my name a little bit a couple of years back. I added Jha in my name. Earlier it was just Priyaranjan, and that's a long story. I mean, I can tell you later at different times. So all these papers have Ranjan as listed as my last name. Anyway, so now there's a lot of literature on trade and unemployment, and so there are a lot of theoretical papers and empirical papers. So theoretical models identify various channels through which trade affects unemployment, and so in these multi-sector models, trade could affect unemployment both by affecting sectoral unemployment rates and intersectoral reallocation of labor. So different sectors of the economy can have different unemployment rates because of various factors, and so when workers move from one sector to another, that would change unemployment in the economy. And there are several models which show that. And then there are models of offshoring, that is what happens if a country offshores more. And usually if you offshore, so if you're producing steering wheels within your plant in Detroit earlier, now you start producing steering wheels in a plant in Mexico, you're sending all those jobs abroad basically. So you're closing the part of your production which was producing steering wheels, and now those workers have to be laid off or employed in something different. So that is the job reallocation effect or job destruction effect. You've destroyed the jobs of workers who are producing steering wheels in your Detroit factory. However, you as a firm become more productive now because you can get these inputs cheaper from abroad, and so demand for your product is going to increase, and that is kind of the productivity effect. So you will sell more cars. As a result, you will need more assembly line workers and so on. So that is the job creation effect, and so these are kind of effects going in opposite directions. So overall effect of offshoring is kind of ambiguous in jobs as shown in these various papers. So let's look at some empirical evidence. So what is the empirical evidence on the relationship between trade and unemployment? So I have this paper with two other guys, Kushan Das and Devashish Mitra, where we empirically study the relationship between trade and unemployment using a cross-country data for 90 countries. So the typo here, it should be cross-country, not across country. Data for 90 countries, and we find a negative relationship between trade liberalization and unemployment. That is, overall, when a country liberalizes trade, in general, there's a negative relationship. That is, unemployment decreases upon trade liberalization. However, we find an interesting time pattern. That is, using the timing of liberalization, we find short-term spikes in unemployment. That is, it's possible that when a country opens up to trade, in the short run, there would be a spike in unemployment for up to 1 to 2 years because a lot of jobs are destroyed in the import competing sector, and creating new jobs in the export sector takes time. And so in the interim, you could see a spike in unemployment, but over a slightly longer horizon of 2 to 3 years, employment recovers, and then there's a decrease in unemployment. And there's a paper by Felbermeyer and co-authors using a smaller OECD countries data set. They find a similar relationship. I also have a paper with three other co-authors where we look at data from Indian states. So we use state level data from India to study the impact of trade liberalization on unemployment, and here we did not find a significant relationship overall. So we could not detect any significant relationship, positive or negative, between trade liberalization and unemployment. However, we found some conditional relationship, that is, trade liberalization reduced unemployment in states with flexible labor market. So there are some indicators of flexibility of labor market which varies across states, and there was a positive interaction. That is, trade liberalization creates kind of more jobs in states which have a more flexible labor market. And we also found we did some industry level analysis and looking at people employed in different industries, and found that trade liberalization reduced the probability of a person becoming unemployed, and also trade liberalization reduced industry specific unemployment with a lag. That is, trade liberalization increased unemployment upon impact, similar to what we had found in the cross country data, but unemployment was reduced over 2 to 3 year periods, which echoes the findings of the Mitra and Ranjan paper that I talked about earlier. Okay, last couple of slides, and then I'll open up to discussions. So trade and local labor market effects. So this paper also can be thought of as local labor market, because here in this exercise we are treating each state as a separate separate labor market. I'm sorry. So to that extent it is local, but this paper talks about commuting zones in the US as a local labor market, and studies the impact of trade with China on the labor market in the US. So this is a very influential paper, and following this paper, there's a whole industry of China shock papers which studies the impact of trade with China on various labor markets in Europe, US, and elsewhere. So what these people do is they treat each commuting zone in the US. So commuting zones are kind of areas. So the idea is that people living in these areas commute to work within this area. So they would draw these circles for commuting zones and look at the impact of trade with China on these local labor markets, and they exploit the fact that various commuting zones have different exposures to Chinese trade. So the exposure to Chinese trade in a commuting zone depends on what is the industrial structure of that commuting zone. If that commuting zone produces a lot of goods that compete with China, then that commuting zone is highly exposed to Chinese imports, and so a lot of jobs could be destroyed in that commuting zone. If a commuting zone does not have a high exposure to Chinese imports because its industrial structure is very different, if it is producing goods for exports, then it won't. And what they find is that increased competition from Chinese exports increased unemployment in the local US labor markets, and it explains about 1/4 of the contemporaneous aggregate decline in the US manufacturing employment. So US manufacturing employment has been shrinking over time, but they attribute a part of that decline to the Chinese imports. And overall, I think they over a 15-year period, they say about 2 million jobs could have been lost because of 2 million manufacturing jobs could have been lost because of Chinese imports. Now, this used to sound pretty big, but when we think about unemployment numbers, this Thursday the U.S. reported that the number of unemployed is 33 million, and the unemployment rate is 15% now. 2 million job losses over a 15-year period sounds tiny compared to what has happened in the last couple of months because of COVID-19. Anyway, but earlier it was considered to be a significant impact. And they also found the negative impact on wages and labor force participation rates of workers, and so basically there's clear evidence that it is very costly for workers to move across regions and sectors, because if that was not the case, then Chinese imports on a commuting zone should be compensated by job creation elsewhere, and those workers could have moved to those other places and found jobs. So there shouldn't have been a decrease in jobs because of import competition with China. There's this book by Angus Deaton, who is a Nobel laureate, and his wife Anne Case. These are both economists at Princeton. They've written a book called Deaths of Despair, and there they talk about these issues about how it is very costly for workers to move, and as a result of destruction of manufacturing jobs, partly because of trade, partly because of automation, robotization, whatever, all those things. Manufacturing jobs in the Midwest of the U.S. A lot of people have stopped working, so that's connected to the idea of decreasing labor force participation rate, and they have basically become depressed, and they start taking drugs, and there have been a lot of deaths related to overdose of opioids, so they call these things deaths of despair. So I haven't read this book yet, but I've seen some reviews, so they talk about these issues connected to job losses.
Jha, you have another 5 minutes.
Yeah,
and maybe you will relate your conclusion to the present situation a little bit.
Yeah, so I should be done in 5 minutes. Okay, now looking at the impact of Chinese imports on local labor markets is only one side of the trade story. The other side is potential job creation effects of trade in export industries. So there's a paper by Feenstra and a couple of his students. So Robert Feenstra is a very famous trade economist at University of California, Davis. That is our sister campus. So he and his co-authors find that although Chinese imports reduce jobs at both the industry level and the local commuting zone level, the global export expansion of US products also creates a considerable number of jobs. And on balance, over this 16-year period, job gains due to changes in US global exports were slightly less than job losses, but they do offset a large part of job losses due to Chinese imports. And they find that overall, you have a 0.2 to 0.3 million job losses, so 200,000 to 300,000. Again, these numbers sound kind of insignificant, not worth our attention at a time where the US economy is losing like 3 to 4 million jobs a week for last 6-7 weeks. Anyway, so and when they extend the analysis to a slightly longer period, they find the net job effect of imports and exports kind of they is a wash basically. They are roughly balanced at the commuting zone level. Okay, so last two slides on policies. So it's clear that not everyone benefits from trade liberalization, even though there are overall gains. There are winners and losers, but if there are overall gains, it should be possible to compensate the losers and make everyone better off. Okay. Now there are also redistributive effects of technological change and demand shocks that are changing tastes and so on. And that also cause losses for workers. So any kind of technological change has a redistributive effect, and trade in some sense is like a technological change. So the question is, should we restrict trade if there are redistributive effects? And the answer is not, unless we cannot adopt effective domestic policy. So if you can redistribute the gains from trade, then you can potentially make everyone better off. But the kind of policies that countries adopt to compensate the workers who could potentially lose is to strengthen social protection measures like unemployment benefits and so on. And there's for both workers who lose from globalization or technological progress and automation. And also active labor market policies have played a role. And so the key social protection measure is unemployment benefits, and people say that, oh, if unemployment benefits is very generous, it's going to create moral hazard that people will become lazy and won't work and so on. So there is a way to fix that. You can make these benefits conditional on attending a back to work program and things like that. However, there is not much evidence that people become lazy and stop working if unemployment benefits are generous. Anyway, other policies could be wage subsidies or wage insurance. So that could compensate workers for wage losses when they're forced into lower paying jobs. And the active labor market policies that I talked about here has proved to be very successful in many European countries. So these are policies of job training, helping re-educate the workers. They learn newer skills so that they can find a job where more jobs are being created, and agencies can help workers find jobs, and so that can play an important role. So things like unemployment benefits are safety nets which prevent people from falling due to these shocks, falling to the ground, say, and getting hurt. But so you have a safety net. That's the idea of safety nets. But these active labor market policies are like trampolines, which allow people to bounce back up. So both these are useful things in terms of compensating workers and helping them getting back their feet. And this is, I think, my last slide. I think I wanted to end here before opening to discussion. Why is there so much opposition to trade? Now, things have changed on the trade front. So when you look at the pattern of trade from the end of Second World War to the 1980s, trade was mainly among rich countries, and this was like exchanging cars, two-way exchange of cars and things like that. So it did not have a lot of redistributive effect. So if the US and Europe or maybe Japan, they are trading, there's not a lot of redistributive effect. Everyone is kind of gaining. However, since then, giants giant labor in abundant countries like China and India have joined world trade, and that has hurt unskilled workers in rich countries, which is consistent with the Skolper-Samuelson theorem and things that we were talking about in terms of rising inequality in the US and other developed countries. And we also saw the impact of of China shock, on adverse shock on labor markets, local labor markets. So there is evidence that import from these labor-abundant countries has hurt workers in the developed countries. Now, while that has been happening, the welfare state has shrunk in many of these countries. So policies to compensate the losers is not adequate. In many of these countries, the welfare state has shrunk in the US since Reagan and in the UK since Thatcher. And so there's more of a backlash against globalization in these countries compared to other European countries, which still have pretty generous welfare state, and welfare state has expanded, if anything. So this has generated a backlash against globalization in many countries and gave rise to Trump in the US and Brexit in the UK and so on. Okay, and I mean, as I have said earlier, things like computerization, robotization, they also lead to job destruction and hurt unskilled workers. However, there's not much opposition against them because you don't have a target. In the case of trade, you have these kind of soft targets in some sense, and so trade becomes much more salient politically. It is easy to scapegoat Chinese and Mexicans, as Donald Trump did successfully. So there's a lot of migration also, which has similar kind of effect. So you can scapegoat Mexican migrants in the US or East European migrants in the UK and so on. I don't have time to talk about migration, so I'll stop here. So it's kind of last point is that it's easier to attack globalization in general than forces of technological change, and that's why there's opposition to trade or backlash against globalization. Okay, so I'll stop here and open the floor for discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Jha. I think that was an excellent overview of the basic issues in the study of globalization and trade, from the very important premises regarding comparative advantage, love of variety, right up to the whole question of effects on labor market, on employment, inequality, and redistributive effects, and the debates on them. Except for that 2 million versus 33 million, I think is a very important overview has to be related to the current situation, which is really gripping us, and it is about the global connections and what is happening to these global connections. But we will discuss that only after our lead discussant, Professor Avanindranath Thakur, has spoken. Hello, Avanindra.
Hello, sir.
You will take about 10, 15 minutes?
Yeah, sure. That's
Okay.
more than enough. Probably I will take 10 because I would
10.
like to attract more questions rather than.
That's right. And other people also can send their questions by chat or any way they like. Otherwise, I don't know how to raise hands here, but they can do that. Priyanka can help people to ask questions. Yes, Avanindra.
So thank you for Professor Jha for this fascinating paper, because your paper actually was also based on theoretical understanding, but also it also based on empirical evidences, and of course your coverage from output growth, role of export in output growth, to consumption variety and unemployment. So it was really fascinating kind of coverage. Probably other slides also had more wider coverage. So I would not summarize your thing because it's very lucid, but from my side, I would love to connect your entire discussion with contemporary situations of COVID, what actually Professor Monti was saying. So look, I have a few queries, because of course that was a fascinating paper, so I have so many queries, so I don't know how I would be able to share that with you. So a few of them are as follows. First, export, the role of export has definitely been very important in growth, particularly many countries have also witnessed export-led growth. But for export-led growth, we need external demand. And for external demand, we need continuous growth in global economy. So what we have been witnessing for probably 2012 onwards, we are not having acceleration in global growth. So basically after 2012, except for the year 17 and 80, we are having deceleration in global growth rate. So, and therefore it is expected that the demand for export would be lower, and if you look at the Indian export basket in the last couple of years, the export growth has been very sluggish. Firstly. Secondly, so how do you see the prospect of export-led growth in a contemporary world when already, even before COVID, we were having a sluggish growth in global output? And this is going to be even worse after this COVID scenario, because it is generally expected that GDP growth would be between -5 to 10, or even maybe higher. Maybe it means there will be wiping out of output from the global economy. So basically, it would take years for the global economy to revive. So in that scenario, how do you see the prospect of export-led growth for a country like India? And secondly, related to this point, and since Thatcher-Reagan era, what is very visible in the global economy, that fluctuations or instability has become a prominent part of global economy. In every 5-7 years, some part of the world are facing a kind of crisis, and of course, fluctuations of export is also witnessed there. In 2008, we had an almost negative growth of export. So, how do you, again, in both the cases, one is the deceleration in growth and forthcoming crisis, and second, high level of instability, global instability. So, how do you expect, that India, what is the prospect of export-led growth for a country like India? This is the first part. Second part, so I just, it's a kind of discussion. I'm just opening this run for discussion. Secondly, I would focus upon, okay, you talked about Stolper-Samuelson theory about, of course, wage equalization, both relative and absolute long-term across countries. So I will not go into that, but I'm very doubtful about its implications, its impact on Indian wage market, Indian labor market. You actually showed a paper, but I have not read that paper, which has come out in 2008. But I have tracked the trend of real wage rate, the trend of growth of real wage rate in India. So if you look at that paper, was written in 2008. So if you look at the rural wage, so if you look at the rate of growth of wage, you will find that 2007 to 11, it was a really high rate of growth for entire wages. However, more growth was there in rural area than in urban area. Acceleration was higher in rural area as compared to urban area. So I have a few queries here. One, since I have a doubt why Stolper-Samuelson theorem might not be working here because of variety of reasons. First, India is still having unemployment, underemployment, and disguised unemployment. Therefore, labor market is not very tight in India. Secondly, share of export sector in total employment is not that high. Still, because even agriculture and allied sector is having nearly 10% or 12% contribution in total export. And thirdly, if you look at the pattern, you will find that the rural wage, existing rural wage in 2007 was much lower than the minimum wage, prescribed minimum wage by the government. So what the trend says that it was basically matching up with the minimum wage rate across India, rural wage rate. And even, so what I see a very important role of MNRG, Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, in order to raise the minimum floor wage in rural area, firstly. And secondly, the boom in the construction sector during that time. And rural construction was also on the rise. So basically, provision of minimum wage in rural area actually filled that gap between existing wage and the minimum wage. because this was the time, if you look at 2007 to 11, you will find that in between that there was a crisis, and during that crisis time, the growth of export was very low. But still, on an average, the real wage was rising, because in 2006, MNRG was implemented. So these things are really, I think you should focus on these, because these are my queries. So I don't know, because other aspect of Stolper Samuelson theory is that wage equalization across countries. So that also I'm not finding it very prominent. If you compare any exporting, India as compared to any OECD or any other countries, that is also not the case. And the other part of same question, I will just end up with that addition, that even in, after having a more than 25 years of trade-based growth, because now our share of trade in GDP is very high, it's one of the highest, but still we could not transform our labor market or the entire labor from informal to formal sector. So structural transformation of output as well as employment has never happened in India. So look at the entire period from where we actually stepped up our growth due to the open economy. We find that the share of formal sector in terms of output and employment remain more or less stagnant. So even in export sector, there are two kinds of wage structure. One is a very core to the sector. One is subletting of works to the informal sector. So those who are working at the core might get higher wage rate, but the maximum people who are basically part of the export sector are working outside the formal economy. So basically, if you look at the entire wage in informal sector, you will find that there is hardly any movement towards filling the gap between formal wage and informal wage. So these are the things. So I will, of course, would like to you to answer those things, but of course there will be many questions, so I will not want to take much time. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Those were very, very important questions. Would you like to respond to them right now, or we'll take some more questions and
I can respond, because otherwise I'll forget.
All right. I'll just add to this two very short questions. It's about 6 years ago that China decided strategically to transform the export-led economy, which gave her the status of the world's second largest economy in 2010, to a domestic demand based economy, and that is still their basic orientation, even though it came along with the Belt and Road Initiative, in a lot of external investment, etc. In other words, why countries which achieve so many, such amount of successes like China decided to do that? That is one question. And in fact, interestingly enough, in the midst of COVID, on the day of the Panchayati Raj, 24th April, Prime Minister Modi, addressing the whole Sarpanches, made a very interesting statement. I think we should look up that speech of his. He said, after COVID, we must re-examine the entire nature of the world economy and our economic system. What a district can produce as far as the local demands are concerned, it should. What a state can produce for its for fulfilling the people's demands at the state level, it should. What a country can, it should, and so on. In other words, it's not autarky. It's a, but at the same time, he is very much a expert, make in India and export-oriented person. What I'm saying is, between Gandhian sentiments and political economy critique of unequal trade, I'm using this term very consciously, because as many of your slides indicated, uh, uh, unequal trade is the characteristic of world trade in various degrees. So my second question is, unless countries develop capacities, regions within countries develop capacity to share and have equitable exchange, trade within regions and among countries which are grossly unequal on those two very important principles that you started with, comparative advantage based on specialization and law for variety and so on. Unless certain capacity and certain degrees of equal exchange are created, the equitable global trade which can also be efficient, those prospects become less and less. And during the last 20 years, inequalities have grown, among regions, within countries, and there is. I'm sure you are familiar with all that. No, not you. Just I'm speaking as moderator. Yeah, sorry. You come as a questioner a little later. All right. So that was the comment I wanted to make. Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you for these comments. So I'll try to answer some of them or just talk about them. So actually, I'm more familiar with a format where one question is asked, I answer, then second, and whatever. So I'm not used to taking too many questions at a time. But anyway, so our traditional seminars are not like this. They're basically people will interrupt you and ask you a question right in the middle of your presentation. So if you have spoken for 10 minutes without a question being asked, that means either no one is understanding or everyone already knows there's nothing new there.
No, that's right for people who are being guided by that. Yes, please go on.
Yeah, anyway. So Avanindra, as to your question about prospect of export-led growth for India, I think India is a very large country and also and it is a market economy. So things are very different from China. So China went for export-led growth because what China did was it had a planned economy and it opened up a segment of its economy, created these coastal special economic zones and which operated by very different rules from rest of China, and so the idea was let's make this part Shenzhen and some other parts a market economy and let them export to the rest of the world, and let's see how that works, and if it works well then we'll kind of adopt it in the whole country. So that's how they went about it, and now that they've seen that it has worked pretty well, I mean they've kind of done it for the whole country. And now I think they realize that this is also kind of related to Professor Mohanty's question that China is the second largest economy in the world now, right? And so it does not really have to rely on export-led growth. It is not sustainable because China's export cannot keep growing at this rate forever because it's become the second largest economy. So now they are trying to transform and increase domestic demand, and there are various factors, various reasons why China's export surplus is still large because I mean people are not consuming much. There's a lot of saving in China. The rate of saving is very high, and at the macro level, if your saving is very high, that reflects in your trade balance as well. So China has, even though it's a communist country, the welfare state in China is pretty parsimonious. So people have to save for their own retirement and they spend a lot of money on healthcare and things. Compared to European countries, China's welfare state is pretty parsimonious or meager or whatever. But they are trying to move away from those things, give a boost to domestic consumption and things like that. So have a more balanced kind of approach. Of course, they will try to keep exporting, but it's not going to be export-led growth. For India, I think I don't think India has to go for export-led growth. India has to go for growth, and export will be a part of the process. And as you mentioned, I think manufacturing has not really taken off in India as it should. I mean, there's this idea about premature deindustrialization. So a lot of these developing countries, they have much smaller share of manufacturing in both value added and jobs compared to rich countries at similar stage of development. And there's a lot of work being done on this issue of premature deindustrialization. But in the context of India, I think uh, there are some serious bottlenecks to manufacturing growth, which needs to be addressed. And once you address that, it will lead to more exports as well. And one can think of a couple of things. One is infrastructure. So manufacturing is much more dependent on infrastructure than services, right? So for IT, maybe people just need computers and they can start providing IT services. But for manufacturing, you need a whole supply chain. You need the roads to be good, power supply to be reliable, and you need ports to be good. All those things, railways have to bring inputs in time. So manufacturing is much more dependent on infrastructure and also on bureaucracy. So Indian corruption does not help manufacturing either. You have to take many more permissions, environment clearance, this clearance, that clearance, a lot of permits, and comply with labor regulations. So I think addressing those two issues, infrastructure and bureaucracy, would help in boosting manufacturing. I think still there's a lot of scope for manufacturing. So Modi has been talking about make in India, and actually one idea would be to create something like Shenzhen on an experimental basis. You know, we have a lot of these special economic zones. I was looking at it, and they are tiny, like 1 square kilometer to 10 square kilometer. The largest one is Mundra, which is 64 square kilometer. Shenzhen, when it started, was 400 square kilometers, and now it's like 2,000 square kilometers. And it's a whole setup, self-contained kind of thing, has excellent infrastructure and operates by its own rules, whatever. So maybe India could experiment with something like that, create a special economic zone with top-class infrastructure, and allow that area to have its own labor laws. Maybe borrow. So I'm a big fan of the Danish flexicurity system when we talk about labor laws. So I don't know whether you guys have been reading. So Denmark has been in the news even now in the context of COVID. They've been kind of one of the best countries in terms of handling the COVID crisis as well. So their labor market policies are very good. So there's very strong protection for workers, very strong social protection, generous unemployment benefits, and so on. But firms have full authority to hire and fire workers, so they can decide who they want. Okay, so there's no obligation for firms to keep any workers. If they fire any worker, that worker can find a job elsewhere. If not, in the interim, the worker can get unemployment benefits. And because of this, it's called flex security system. You have flexibility as well as security. Denmark's employment rate is one of the highest in the world. So 80% of
Right.
between the ages of 18 and 64, something like that, are employed in Denmark, while in the US that number is 60%. So we were talking about decline in participation rate and so on. So I would be in favor of creating a special economic zone of maybe 400 kilometers with top infrastructure and world-class labor laws, and see how it goes, and maybe then it can be spread all over India. I think that could give a boost to manufacturing, and with COVID interruption, unemployment is going to spike a lot. So it would be a good time to engage in these infrastructural projects at this time, because it will create jobs in the short run, and if it gives a boost to manufacturing, there would be long run employment creation as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so Yeah, as far as Struper Samuelson is concerned, I mean that theorem has limited applicability. I think it's very useful in studying the impact of trade on inequality. And for developed countries, there is evidence. For developing countries, yeah, I pointed out that paper by Kumar and Mishra, but there are too many things going on in the case of developing countries. So it's difficult to detect that pattern. But you were mentioning this thing about factor price equalization, which is an implication of a Herschelian kind of trade, but that is that requires very strong assumptions. No one expects it to hold in reality, because you need all countries to have access to exactly identical technologies for that to work. And there are huge productivity differences, right? So the US per capita income is 30 times the Indian per capita income. So there's no way that trade between the US and India is going to equalize factor prices. Okay, so that's just not going to happen. So you have to improve productivity of a country to catch up with rich countries. So the only way to catch up is to improve productivity across the board. So creating a better infrastructure, getting rid of bureaucratic bureaucratic hoops that firms have to jump through. Those things could be useful, and there could be a scope for improving labor laws as well, as I was mentioning earlier. Yeah, so structural transformation, yes, I mean that's what development process is about, as you said, mentioned, and I'm actually working on structural transformation. So that is really a puzzling issue. That is why didn't workers move from agriculture to manufacturing, and why did they directly go to services? In India, we seem to have skipped the manufacturing stage of structural transformation. And so some of the things that I was mentioning earlier about creating infrastructure and reducing bureaucratic intervention and so on, they could help in the process of structural transformation, creating more formal sector jobs as well. I don't know. Maybe in this special economic zone, you can mandate that there's not going to be any informal jobs. So all jobs have to be informal. Everyone has to be paid a living wage. You cannot pay any. I mean, I would like to go beyond minimum wage. Ideally, in my kind of world, everyone should get a living wage. If a job cannot pay a worker a living wage, that job should not exist. That's my, my philosophy on minimum wage and living wage. So I would like to go beyond minimum wage, in fact, but that may be too idealistic. I mean, in a country like India, where 75% of the jobs are in the informal sector, but that is a goal that one should to achieve.
93% jobs.
90.
90%.
Yeah.
Yeah. So right, 90% probably. So yeah. So it's really challenging. I think MNREGA has definitely played an important role in improving the bargaining power of workers in rural areas. So there's a lot of evidence. My colleague at UC San Diego, Karthik Muralidharan, has done a study about how MNREGA has increased the bargaining power of workers in rural areas. So employers have to pay higher wages to workers, because they know that these guys have the option of getting at least the MNREGA wages for 100 days or what. So that has lifted the floor, as you probably mentioned, and so I think that is good.
I think
We definitely need to create more formal sector jobs, and I mean the idea of making India is great, but I haven't seen much action on that. More words, less action.
Okay,
And,
Professor Jha, I think let's take some more questions. It will be
okay.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Priyanka, will you find out how other people can ask questions?
Either they can write the questions in the chat box, or they can just simply intervene and switch on their cameras and ask a question.
Okay.
Could you invite Professor Juan?
I have a question. Here.
Okay, good day.
Sir, I think Professor Jha must be congratulated for putting the
hardcore textbook theory and theoretical and empirical analysis together, putting it in the outcome analysis. But I have a comment and a question. The question is that this kind of process of globalization doesn't really work in an Indian situation where political economy factors are super strong. A. B, that the textbook assumption they do not meet at all, as Minder was also talking about it. C, that we haven't learned anything from Chinese model of decentralization, non-state sector, and also the way they price efficiencies they have generated all along in their economies. So these are the two sets of issues. This is something which is very, very important, and it was directly related to the COVID-19 that this migration issue occurred. You see, the globalization also brings the health linkages. It's very unfortunate. Long back, we wrote an article on the issue of SARC and things like that. And I'm forgetting, my memory is very bad. But we brought it very clearly that in the days to come, this globalization health linkages will be very, very serious. And this Chinese perspective was also brought out. This probably 10 years before or so. So my point is that when we talk about globalization, we cannot divorce it from the hardcore realities of the grassroots realities and assumptions of the country like India. That is one part. So all in all your models, the textbook assumptions, they do not tally. That is something which is very, very important. That is the reason that Make in India model failed. Second. Third, which is very, very important, which I am saying is that, this process of globalization, we have talked about the digital globalization. But let's not forget the fourth industrial revolution. Let's not forget the gig economy. Let's not forget the informalization of the casualization of the Indian economy and the social measures and the protective measures for inclusive economy. All those are lacking in this country. So the such kind of models of trade which are based on hardcore assumptions of the textbook really do not match with our grassroots realities. And the political economy factors have to be taken into account. Probably the behavioral economics need to be more interlinked to such issues. That is one part of the story. The second is that, the employment generation. Nindra has raised a very super important point. Employment elasticity, for instance. Can you imagine a situation, the structural fault? You said this is an automatic process of structural change when growth and we have for years together had a high rate of growth and we have risen much above from Hindu rate of growth, but we have not been able to bring a change in the structural retrogression which was there. 100 years before even independence, the structural pattern was the same. It continues to be the same even today. So you see, the hardcore textbook model, they do not of trade, they do not give any relief to the marginalized population of this country, which continues to be at least 60 to 70%. Thank you.
Thank you. I will not ask Professor Jha to respond just now. I think let's take a few more questions. Yeah.
Can I intervene? Hello.
Yes, Varun. Yes.
Come in now. Yeah, please.
This is Varun Bigman. So my question is, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my question is that in the whole discourse of the economy and growth, major factor that I feel is missing is the question of ecology. And the question, is it possible? I mean, this obsession with the idea of incessant growth, is it compatible with the idea of a sustainable ecology or a sustainable model? Because the more you the countries, developing world, the more they are in tune with the idea of growth, the more the problem they might face as the ecological problems will become more severe. The new diseases are coming, infectious diseases are coming again. So is there a way out? Can we have a sustainable development model which sort of balances the idea of developmental growth with a future for the mankind?
Good question. let's take 3 questions. I think that will be manageable. A third one, let's take. Anybody else? Yeah. Who is next? Narendra, come in.
Uh, I will come a little later.
Okay, all right. So the ecology question is one, but going back to labor, I'll just supplement both these points, political economy and ecology. Well, let me sort of, we are in India in the midst of, I'm sure in the US also, in the midst of so many anxieties. 2 days ago, the Chief Minister of UP announced that, actually had an agreement with the Japanese ambassador saying that for 3 years, UP has offered to suspend the labor laws and facilitated Japanese investment to come in because the Japanese have created this $2 trillion fund to support companies who want to leave China and go abroad. So using that. And this comes a few months after the government had introduced a bill, not a law yet, reducing 44 protective labor legislations into one single 4-dimensional labor code, which is to the liking of the corporate sector. Okay, and the trade unions unanimously, including the BJP trade union, Mazdoor Sangh, have opposed that labor code. In other words, the the political economy reality that Guljeet was talking about, one dimension Amarendra covered, the rural structure, which Manrega tried to address, and now in this COVID thing, again we are relying on Manrega to provide work to the return migrant labor in many places. That will give some relief. And in the rural as well as the urban sector, particularly in the urban sector, casualization and informalization has become such a trend. Insecurity, labor insecurity has become the norm. And in this migrant labor exodus, we are seeing that very directly now. Therefore, how to add to that the sustainability dimension? I think during the last 100 years, what Industrial Revolution 1, 2, and 3 have done to the environment, has been pretty well documented. So, and this kind of industrialization has been promoted by globalization. You want to come in now?
Yeah.
One more question, please. Yeah.
Can I make the observation?
Yeah, just one more. Just hold on for a second. Yeah.
Actually, it is predicted that after the COVID, India will become more agricultural. And since it has abundance of labor supply and abundant natural resources, do you think she will reap the comparative advantage by going through the, using the agricultural resources not only in farm sector but also in non-farm sector?
Okay.
So what do you think?
I think somebody else was coming in for one more comment.
Yeah. Can I make a small observation?
Okay, Satish, yeah.
In fact, I was reminded of listening to this presentation. I was reminded of a statement made by Raghuram Rajan a few years ago when he was Governor Reserve Bank. That in today's world, perhaps China cannot be accommodated, and therefore India has to look inward in terms of generating demand. And what he was basically hinting at that given the federal nature of our polity, we should find out 29 markets inside in order to deepen the demand here. And when GST idea was to turn these 29 markets at that time, now you have 28, into one market in order to consolidate this entire structure of demand. But what we find today, particularly in the backdrop of this COVID, this entire federal, discourse is going from bad to worse. The kind of money is,
switch off your
seen
camera, switch
witnessing
off your
today between
camera.
the states and
अपना
the
कैमरा ऑफ
center,
कर लीजिए, आप कुछ खा पी रहे
I
हैं.
don't see much prospect on that front, particularly in terms of the expansion of the demand inside through a more coordinated effort of the states in the center and deepening this entire process of generating demand in the domestic market. So in fact, my query is that how this issue should be looked at. The another query which I have, that normally as a layman, not someone who is from economics, we have been hearing about three factors of production: land, labor, and capital. And we have heard over the years, particularly when people have talked about second generation reforms in India, that India has to work on labor reforms, India has to work on acquisition law, and India has to work in direction of attracting more foreign investment, that is capital. But the fourth variable, which has also been highlighted in context of India, which is very uncommon, is the archaic laws which exist in India, particularly after this retrospective taxation happened after the Vodafone episode. That how to fix that issue, along with certain environmental laws which were enforced, perhaps rightly so, but that is considered a kind of impediment to the path of second generation reforms. So therefore, it is often, I find often in media that those experts on Indian economy, they come and they hold these four things responsible for not allowing Indian, the growth story to go forward. So in fact, I just wonder that, particularly the talk of labor reforms, we find here perhaps they mean by reforms some retrospective measures, some measures which are perhaps detrimental to the interest of labor force. Some of the gains which have been made over the years through very, sustained struggle through, trade union movements and other things. So simply they want to overturn it. So in fact, it is a very, complex situation that in order to promote this growth story, you have to, simply, consign this entire gains, historically attained gains through, labor movement in the industry, and then only you move forward. Similarly, land-related legislation, this land acquisition, laws. UPA did, Modi has done it, but nonetheless, we know that how the agriculture, particularly those who are dependent on agriculture in countryside, how their interests are sacrificed in order to serve the interests of the corporates. So therefore, it's a very puzzling situation for someone who is not economics. Therefore, I would like Professor Jha to respond to this.
Okay, Professor Jha, to the questions briefly,
Yeah.
and we'll have another round also. Yeah.
Okay, let's see. I mean, yeah, too many questions. I mean, these are all very interesting comments, and they are not directly about trade as such. So, I mean, I have to go well beyond my area of expertise to comment on these, but I'll try to say a few things in response to each. So, Professor Arora, was it, who was talking about political economy issues? Yeah, I mean, globalization's health linkage, you are absolutely right. If all countries were in autarky, we would not have coronavirus reaching other countries. It would be probably confined where it originated. So it has come through trade. In fact, people have trade linkages. So there's some preliminary work about the correlation where it came first. So you can in fact see that if a country trades a lot with China, that country got the virus earlier. Okay, so in the case of India, I think one student got it from Wuhan, but most of it has come from Europe, Italy, and Switzerland and other places. But there is a correlation. The more you trade with China, the earlier you got the virus. So and I mean, uh, we've had lot of trade related health issues. So all these things, viruses and different insects, in fact, come through shipping containers to other places, and they devastate crops and all kinds of things. So yeah, globalization, and in fact, one should have a more cooperation on public health issues. So that is one form of globalization. Maybe benefits would be more than benefits from further liberalizing trade. If you create, for example, a pool of global resources for developing a vaccine for COVID, or treatment for COVID, and the whole world can benefit from that research, that would be an excellent idea, and that would be an excellent form of globalization. As far as in India, things being very different in India with respect to globalization is concerned, I'm not so sure. I mean, all countries have their political economy issues which prevent reforms and changes. You have vested interests and everything. But I think countries which can overcome some of those impediments have been successful, and so countries like South Korea and Taiwan and Singapore, they were not very different from India in the 50s and 60s, but they went on a different track. And now you will say those are very small countries, things are very different there. Then you have China, which was same as India in 1980, and now China is 4 times richer than India. And so they've been successful in reforming their economy and exploit trade opportunities. And more recently, you have the examples of Bangladesh and Vietnam. So Bangladesh is doing much better in terms of manufacturing than India, and they have this huge textile sector. So maybe we can learn something from Bangladesh in terms of making in India. How are they able to have such a dynamic manufacturing sector, textiles in particular, and they export so much more textiles than India. And Vietnam is doing something similar. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for creating manufacturing jobs in India. You do need some reforms. What kind of reforms? I mean, we can talk about it. Satish, you mentioned several things there. I mean, land, labor, capital. I mean, these are all tricky issues. So we have a lot of laws from 1923, 1920, 1946, British era laws that we have to take a look at, and we have to see whether they are serving any useful purpose right now, because we have a lot of good practices to look at in other countries and borrow from, just as we borrowed our constitution from Irish constitution and American constitution. We can borrow some of these labor laws from other countries. I was mentioning Denmark earlier, which has been doing very well. So if trade unions in Denmark are very happy with the labor laws in Denmark, why cannot we copy some of them here in the US? Why cannot we reform our labor laws? I'm not asking for trashing trade unions or cutting worker protections. Those things can be there, but that can be combined with giving firms the flexibility of what kind of workers they need, and if some worker is not up to the task, they should have the freedom to fire those workers. So I'm open. I'm not ideological at all. Okay, so whatever works, I would love to see India become a developed country, and whatever it takes, we should do that. That's kind of my bottom line. Uh, in terms of ecology, yeah, I mean, I think climate change is the greatest challenge of our lifetimes, and everyone has to think in terms of sustainable growth, and some simple things like carbon tax can play a huge role, right? So you impose a carbon tax industries which are creating more pollution, and that would reduce those activities. So I think there's a lot of role for global cooperation in that area as well. So when we think about globalization, I mentioned health, but global cooperation on climate change is something that is even more important. Unfortunately, in the US, we have a president who believes that climate change is a Chinese hoax and is withdrawn from the Paris Treaty. And instead of moving forward, we are going backwards on climate treaties and so on. Hopefully, the November election would have a different outcome, and then we can again get back to global cooperation on climate. And countries like India and China have a very important role to play there, because these are the countries which are facing these sort of trade-offs, that they still have a lot of manufacturing, a lot of polluting industries, and if carbon tax is imposed, their industries would suffer more. So you have to have an adequate compensation regime in place. So countries which are going to be more affected through carbon taxes or these treaties to limit carbon emission, those countries should be compensated, because rich countries are past that phase of industrialization. So they are the ones primarily responsible for creating so much carbon in the atmosphere. So there should be an adequate compensation regime. But absolutely, we need to figure out a way for sustainable growth. And I'm not a fan of these growth numbers. In fact, whenever I think about these, I think the headline numbers should be about employment, creating jobs, rather than focusing on these headline growth numbers. What else? There was a question about will India become more agriculture? Pardon? Yeah, about agriculture. So whether India will become more agriculture dependent. If you look at the productivity of developed and developing countries, it turns out that the productivity gap in agriculture is even more than in manufacturing. So Indian agriculture is way less productive than Indian manufacturing compared to the US. So the gap in agriculture is very large. And I don't think India is going to be a huge agricultural powerhouse, because most of the farming is subsistence farming, right? You have very small plots of land, and agriculture is very labor intensive. Labor is probably the only input. They don't use much of other inputs. You don't even have a lot of irrigation facilities. So I think creating probably manufacturing jobs is easier than making agriculture productive, competitive in India. So I don't think we can rely too much on agriculture in terms of exports or creating jobs. In fact, there are too many people employed in agriculture as it is. We need to move those workers to manufacturing.
Okay. Now we have 5 minutes more.
Can I come?
Now?
Yes, I want to come now.
Yeah.
I think I must congratulate Priyaranjan for this presentation, particularly for one concept that he gave, the living wage versus the minimum wage. And I would like to extend that to dignified living wage, not only living wage, but the ways through which we can live with dignity. I think that is very important. I have a couple of questions. One is that could there be something in between the Gandhian utopia versus the political economy rejection of globalization? And in that situation, is there something new coming up, particularly after COVID-19, which might give India a major advantage in terms of trade? What that could be? What is the emerging technological challenge that India can pick up much more in advance? And like the .com advantage, India might take the advantage of that. I have something in mind that I heard Barack Obama talking at some stage about the brain research. and probably in the in the American brain research, Indian people are contributing a lot, as I'm reading at many places. So is it that we can take advantage in some reason? Because the manufacturing thing that Priyaranjan has been saying, I don't see great advantage in that, because the margin of profit is very low in that. Of course, employability will be more, but as the European world is going for, and the American world is going for arms industry much more, and probably India wants to follow, and therefore there's an arms corridor now being imagined. That will be disastrous for India for other reasons. But the small manufacturing that they have transferred to us will not be of great advantage. We can't take a leap forward. So is there anything else where we can enter and take advantage? Third thing is, how could we combine, as a lot of people talked about the labor law and the ecological problems. So this inverse ratio between labor informalization and growing trade is something is worrisome. I mean, this massive migration of rural labor from Delhi to their homes has actually exposed the Indian labor situation completely to the world. That this is what, if 90% people are working in the informal sector, there is no job security despite so much of growth rate, then what is the guarantee that in future with the growing trade we will have that kind of thing? How can we go about it? And last is that, do you think this COVID-19 would also impact on the international migration of services and goods? I'm not sure, but services particularly, where migration of human beings is also more or less necessary. Thank you.
Okay. Well, Priyaranjan,
Yeah.
yes, please.
Okay, thank you, Manindraji. So, well, in terms of opportunity, that as a reason due to Corona crisis, I think the tremendous opportunity is in the drugs case, and in fact, India already exploited it a little bit. So I was very happy that Modi allowed the shipment of hydroxychloroquine to the U.S. There was some talk about banning export of it. And the US was thinking about retaliating. But then Modi allowed the export, which I thought turned out to be a brilliant move, because it has been proved that hydroxychloroquine is useless for treating COVID. So India got a lot of money by exporting that drug to the US. Otherwise, it would have been sitting in Indian warehouses. But more generally, India has been exporting a lot of drugs to many countries, all kinds of drugs for treatment of. I mean, there's no treatment of COVID, but whatever alleviating things they give while the patient is sick. So India has been exporting a lot of those things, and India will play a big role in manufacturing vaccines when they find a vaccine. So India, everyone is banking on India to ramp up the production of vaccines. So vaccine production is not easy, and creating capacity for vaccine production is not easy. But India has something called Serum Institute and things. So largest capacity of producing vaccines in the world. So once a vaccine is created, we will need more than 7 billion vaccines, and that will be a tremendous opportunity for India to exploit. And when you're saying that a small manufacturing is not going to help, but if you look at the history of these manufacturing powerhouses, what they do is they always start with simpler stuff, and then they move up the value chain, and they start producing more and more sophisticated stuff. So if you look at China and Hong Kong, they were, even Hong Kong was making plastic flowers in the 1960s, and China started with apparels and footwear and so on, and now it produces everything. Right, iPhone is assembled there, and China, and now the U.S. Government's action of prohibiting export to Huawei and things, they are forcing Huawei and other Chinese companies to produce their own chips, and soon they will capture the chips market as well. So they've gone from producing very simple apparels and footwear to producing sophisticated computer chips now. So you gradually learn by doing, and you improve your production capacity, you move up the value chain. Migration of labor, this is sad. My guess is that once things settle down, these workers will come back. So I know the reality of Bihar. I don't think there are many jobs in Bihar. So these workers will have to come back to Delhi once the COVID threat subsides. Because there are simply not enough jobs there. I think they've done a good job in terms of creating infrastructure, but still, for some reason, jobs have not been created, and so workers will keep flocking to these metropolitan cities where most of the jobs are. And I mean, coronavirus is affecting migration in a big way. So India has already sent all these ships to bring workers back from the Gulf, and planes are ferrying them every day. So that is going on, and that is going to have a huge negative impact on India. It's pretty worrying because India is the largest recipient of remittances. So remittances are going to suffer a lot because of the COVID lockdown in a lot of countries, and my hope is that these workers are able to go back to their jobs in Gulf and countries once things settle down. Otherwise, it is going to be another big negative shock to countries like India and other countries which depend on remittances. So I don't know, that kind of a response to some things that you raised.
Thank you very much. It has been an excellent presentation and very, very interesting discussion. Just three quick comments. I think the pandemic has produced the most intense globalization of consciousness. I think the tragedy, watching each other's countries, each other's state of infection, death, curing, and who is experimenting with what, how experience of one can be shared, healthcare, and so on, and who is stuck where and who is moving where, who has to move, and so on. So this is the most sort of one of the peak moments of globalization, of communication, health linkages, treatment linkages, that one. And I think all disciplines, including economics, have to cope with the new categories emerging from this intense global moment. Second, these, we see today solidification of boundaries and solidification of linkages, both at the same time. We want to share things, connecting. We are now in different parts of the world and connected. And Modi, for the first time, addressed or attended the NAM meeting in 6 years' time, 7 years. And he was not interested in anything Nehru connected, NAM and all that. But boundaries, look at, villagers are not allowing return migrants. Countries are sealing borders, suspending visas, just to give you an example. Therefore, I think a new paradigm of boundary and connection will be redrawn, and obviously the terms have to be more equitable, more dignified than before. Finally, nature is entering in a big way to our discourse in all disciplines. The question about ecology, sustainable development, we social scientists have an economic calculus as the center of calculus, which doesn't take social cost as well as environmental cost.
And carbon tax is not the answer. It's they are, it's like the rich people paying fines and getting away with environmental destruction. Really changing laws. Modi changed the environment laws. Trump changed the environment laws, and so on. So, but the COVID moment is consolidating a trend which bringing in sustainability to be redefined as a new relationship between nature and the human world. Therefore, I think all disciplines, Professor Jha, have to rethink their basic categories, including my discipline, politics, and all social sciences. Well, thank you very much. It has been quite interesting, quite enjoyable discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priyaranjan.
Thank
So
you,
we'll
everyone.
be
Yeah, it
in
was a
touch.
pleasure.
I think we should have another round with you on migration itself, because I could see a lot of slides on migration. So we'll have that discussion again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Priyanka, you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Priyaranjan Jha, for this wonderful insight that you've given us. And I thank the chair, Professor Priyaranjan Mohanty and Avindranath Thakur for bringing in their beautiful comments and their insight. Lastly, I thank the audience for being so wonderful, patient, and enthusiastic all throughout the presentation. And I wish all of you all join us again for our future endeavors. I think we should call it a day now. Thank you.
Just to inform that in this audience there are many people from different walks of life. Like there is a doctor from London, a nephrologist, Vibhasji. So there are many people I can't really count at this moment. But thank you, everybody. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Stay safe, keep well, keep high spirit.
Yeah,
Thank
sure.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think it was great discussion. Thank you. Very nice. I'm happy that you could join. So we were so depressed that we were not able to join this.
Yeah, I could not see anybody, but at least
I'm surprised because we can see you. Maybe we'll work it out
I
what to
think
do.
it is the hide participants.
Yeah.
That's what.
Like Asutosh is here. See Asutosh, Professor Asutosh from Hindi department, Delhi University. I can see now him. Dharmendra is around.
Yeah, Dharmendra, I have been seeing him in our migration seminar.
Okay. Thank you, Asutosh, for coming.
Thank you, thank you. So I'm just trying to see how I can.
Let us check that. Let's check that. Now, some of them don't have their photographs, I guess.
No, but you have.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, we are getting your.
I am not able to see that.
My camera is off at the moment.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
You switch it on.
Yeah.
Ah, look. Now I can see you. So therefore.
Dharmendra, can you switch on the camera?
Sure, I'm here.
Yeah, where is your camera? Switch on the camera.
Sure.
Yeah, here's Dharmendra.
No, but I can't see Dharmendra.
I'll show you. Now, can you see now?
No, let me
Pin him. Pin him down.
Pin him. Right. No.
No?
Still not.
Sure. Surprise.
Now Dharmendra.
Yeah.
Sir, I couldn't get that on YouTube.
Oh no, there was some technical problem. It has been recorded. Now it will be